Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. In the wake of the civil rights, Black Power, and anti-war movements, young Latinos and African Americans joined forces in the late 1960s to create the Young Lords, a militant human rights organization that fought for neighborhood empowerment in poor, predominantly Latino neighborhoods, and for the liberation of Puerto Rico from US control. Like the Black Panthers, they were portrayed by the government and the news media as violent urban terrorists. But were they? In her new book, The Young Lords, A Radical History, Johanna Fernández, a professor of history at Baruch College, paints a comprehensive and nuanced portrait of who the Young Lords were, of the social and political forces that created them, and of what they accomplished in a few short years. Welcome.
Thank you so very much for having me.
The Young Lords came to being. They started in Chicago and then in New York in 1969. What would you say was the impetus for creating the organization, and how would you describe its founding members?
Well, as you said, the Young Lords emerged as a gang in Chicago that was transformed into a political organization and radicalized over the course of the 1960s. In many ways, the organization in political form was a response to police brutality, deindustrialization in urban centers like Chicago, New York, Detroit, Philadelphia. That's the creation of permanent unemployment because industries were moving out of the cities and into the suburbs. And we tend to think of that as a phenomenon exclusive to white working class people, but before deindustrialization hit white working class communities, it eviscerated communities of color in cities like New York, the Bronx, which was an industrial belt, if you will, of the period, poor housing, all of the problems that are with us today were the problems that inspired a new generation of young people to fight for equality, both racial and economic, in a context of national movements across the world against colonial rule in places like Africa and Asia.
You also noted, and I didn't know this, that between the end of World War II and 1970, 1/3 of the residents of the island of Puerto Rico had moved to the mainland. And there was a really huge surge of Puerto Ricans who came to New York and to Chicago and to other places. And so basically, these were second generation Puerto Ricans who started this movement. And it was interesting that in Chicago, as you said, it started as a street gang, whereas in New York, it was founded by college students. The founders were different in the two places.
So in Chicago, this street organization, if you will, forms in order to protect Mexican and Puerto Rican youth from white hostility, literally. And these were pre-existing organizations that the new migrants created. But in New York, the organization was composed not of youth who were politicized through their interaction with ethnic whites in the streets and police violence. It emerged out of the experience of a new generation of young Puerto Rican youth who graduated from high school and were among the first to gain access to college for the first time through these college discovery programs, a kind of affirmative action which incidentally benefited working class and poor whites disproportionately, gave these communities, but also communities of color, Puerto Ricans and Black Americans, access to Hunter College, Baruch, City College at the time. So this was in New York, a very astute cohort of young people who were radicalized in college during the age of civil rights, Black power, and the anti-war movement. And they began to ask questions about where struggle should reside, or where their relationship to struggle should reside. Should they stay in the university, or should they seek to build revolution in the community? And they decided on the latter.
So they were influenced by the Black Panthers and also by nationalists in the Cuban Revolution and Vietnamese nationalists. They wore berets, military-style garb. They marched through the streets of East Harlem in military formation. And they had the structure and discipline of, I guess, what we would call some revolutionary Marxist organizations, correct?
Correct. So you have to remember that this is the age of the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And Ernesto Che Guevara and Castro were adored revolutionary figures by the New Left, of which the Young Lords and the Black Panthers were a part. In fact, the famous berets of the Black Panther Party were a nod to the revolutionary barbudos of the Cuban Revolution. These radicals of this period, 2 million of whom were young students polled in the United States, who said that they believed in the significance and importance of building a revolutionary party in 1969. They were influenced by the nationalist movements against colonial rule in this period. And so they reflected in their organizational structure this revolutionary army exemplified by the guerrillas of the Cuban Revolution, but also in Vietnam. And they thought of themselves as an embryonic government of a liberated nation. So they had a proto-militaristic organizational formation with, for example, a central committee as its leading organizational figures, which was composed of a chairman and 4 or 5 ministers who were chief ministers of areas of life like education, health, media and information, and defense. So they wore uniforms, and they even were committed to self-defense, and many of them were trained in the martial arts. At that point, they believed that they would be attacked by the police and that they would have to defend their members, the community, and the organization against aggression on the part of the police.
There was very strict discipline and a lot was required of the members, correct?
Absolutely. The Young Lords and the Black Panthers were known famously for being members of the organization 25 hours a day. They had a 13-point program in the Young Lords. The Black Panthers had a 10-point program, and members were expected to memorize the platform and program of the organization. Essentially, what do we stand for, and what do we believe? In the case of the Young Lords, the first point of the 13-point program read, "We believe in the independence of Puerto Rico." And the last program read, "We want to build a socialist society." The Young Lords are important in part because they amplified the quiet imperial project of the United States on the island. And previously you mentioned that between 1950 and 1960 or so, a third of the people of the island of Puerto Rico migrated to cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And that was a product of the United States industrialization project on the island known as Operation Bootstrap, which displaced more peasants and workers than it actually absorbed into that emerging industrial economy. And migration was seen as the escape valve of that surplus class of unemployed workers produced by Operation Bootstrap. And in many ways, the formation of the Young Lords reflects the formation of the civil rights and Black Power movements. Those movements were the product of mass migrations of Black Americans from countryside to city. We see the same with Puerto Ricans, with Mexicans and Mexican Americans migrating to the cities during this period from the South and the Southwest and from Mexico, but also Native Americans are migrating to the cities during this period. And this is the time when people of color begin the process of being transformed into minority majority populations.
In order to address a lot of some of the social problems that existed in the Latino community, the Young Lords engaged in sort of guerrilla style actions, very sudden, dramatic actions that disrupted the normal everyday activities in order to dramatize what the problems in the communities were. And you mentioned several of them. And if you could sort of summarize them rather briefly, what they did. First was the garbage offensive. There was the garbage offensive, there was the occupation of the church, the Methodist Church in East Harlem, and the Lincoln Hospital occupation. Can you give me a sense of what these were about?
So the Young Lords, like the Black Panthers, were self-proclaimed revolutionary nationalists and Marxists who believed that capitalism was organized around profit, and they wanted to build a society organized around human needs. So they were socialists. And they wondered, well, how are we going to bring these ideas into our communities, East Harlem and Harlem? And so part of what the Young Lords do is that they poll the East Harlem community on the problems most affecting its residents, and the residents say the garbage. And so the Young Lords begin to pick up the garbage, literally, in the street. And the garbage was bulk garbage. We had abandoned cars and refrigerators in New York City, not just in East Harlem, although Harlem and East Harlem and the Bronx experienced the problem more profoundly because of environmental racism. But they started to pick up the garbage and believed that the sanitation department would haul it out, and it didn't. And so alongside of the community, they started to haul the garbage into the middle of the street and block traffics for blocks and blocks and blocks on end. The New York Times and the politicians picked up on these militant protests, peaceful urban guerrilla protests, and the issue made it to the mayoral debates of that fall. This was the moment of the mayoral elections, and the muckraking and militancy of the Young Lords worked. And this was not a one-time event. Over the course of the summer of 1969, they protested the horror of sanitation in East Harlem and denounced it as environmental racism daily for months on end. And the community gathered along with them to burn the garbage.
Did it result in better sanitation services to East Harlem?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it did. Sanitation services improved, and in fact, the mayor of New York, Mayor Lindsay at the time, sent his representatives to meet with the Young Lords, which they declined, the Young Lords, that is, because they did not believe that politicians had the best interests of the community in mind. Another very important thing is that they named their first campaign the Garbage Offensive in deference to the Tet Offensive of the Vietnamese in 1968 in Vietnam, which was a military campaign on the part of the Vietnamese that attacked American forces in the cities for the first time, rather than in the jungle. A very dramatic operation that began the conclusion, in many ways, the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War.
What were some of the other accomplishments of the Young Lords as a result of these guerrilla actions?
Well, the campaign they turned to next was one that has not really been written about much, but I address it in my book, the lead poisoning offensive. There was a crisis of childhood lead poisoning in East Harlem, and what were known as lead belts across the city, where housing had fallen into disrepair. And that meant that the walls of units in dilapidated buildings had lead-based paint, and children would eat the chips of paint on the ground and essentially would become poisoned. And as you know, lead is a neurotoxin that leads to permanent brain damage. The Young Lords got to work. They hijacked literally a series of tests, and they worked with technicians and nurses and workers and doctors at Metropolitan Hospital. They went door to door and tested children for lead poisoning. And they discovered that 30% of the children they tested in East Harlem were lead poisoned. And they took to the media in these very eloquent, elaborate press conferences of theirs, in which they shamed the city for allowing Puerto Rican and Black American children to die in ways that they would not allow if the kids were white and wealthy.
Also had a big, raised the issue of patients' rights, in particular at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx.
Absolutely. They occupied the hospital to dramatize the horrific conditions of health under which Black and brown patients were being cared for. And as a result of their activism in the summer of 1970, in July, they drafted the first ever Patient Bill of Rights, which denounced racial discrimination in medicine, and essentially established that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and that patients have a right to know what drugs are being prescribed, what their diagnosis is, and the plans the doctor proposes for their healing.
So there were
something that we take for granted today.
Yeah, there were a number of, it seemed, long-lasting reforms that the Young Lords contributed to. First of all, they raised the visibility of the Latino community in New York City as an oppressed group, and what its many needs were. The concept of community control was one, that the people in the community should be able to control what happens to them. Patients' rights, as you mentioned, prisoners' rights was an area, and led in part to the creation of the New York City Board of Corrections to monitor conditions in the city prisons. And you said that they coined the term Latino.
That's correct. The victories and radical reforms won by the Young Lords and others of their period were epic.
What do you want readers to take away from the book?
The story of the Young Lords is an untold story. The organization, I think, is one of the most effective organizations of the New Left, of this period of Black power and civil rights. The Young Lords were important because they captured the imagination of their generation. They were one of the most ethnically diverse organizations of the period. A third of the organization was composed of Black Americans, and approximately 5 to 8% was composed of other non-Puerto Rican Latinos. The Young Lords asked the question in a moment of uprising, who am I? The quintessential existential question, who am I and who do I want to be? And with that question, they actually gave their generation the language to explain the condition of neo-colonization, racial oppression, and white supremacy and economic inequality under which Black Americans and Puerto Ricans lived. But they also attempted to, a scientific analysis and strategy for transforming society. So the questions they kept on asking were, what is the significance of organization? And what is it gonna take to fundamentally transform society? So they combined theory and an analysis and understanding of society with practice. And they gave Puerto Ricans a big coming out party. They established in many ways a different perception of Puerto Ricans, who in many ways were talked about like Mexicans are today. Right. And through their defiant militant protest, they put forth a different sense of Puerto Ricans at the helm of smart, humorous, strategic, militant, radical action that transformed the city.
I thought it was a fascinating book in what I learned about the history of Puerto Ricans in this country, and about who the Young Lords really were and what they really did, as opposed to the version that one often hears from the government and from the media. So thank you for that, and I think a lot of people will find the book fascinating and will learn a lot about it. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I want to thank Professor Johanna Fernández, the author of The Young Lords, A Radical History, for joining me today.
Thank you so very much for this conversation.
For the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.